Fear controls more lives than any dictator ever could. It keeps people small, trapped, and powerless, whispering lies about what might happen if they dare to act. But the ancient Stoics discovered a weapon so powerful against fear that most people refuse to use it, not because it doesn't work, but because it demands something they're not willing to give: the courage to face their deepest terror head-on. This weapon isn't positive thinking, visualization, or any modern self-help technique. It's something far more radical and infinitely more effective. The Stoics called it negative visualization, and it might be the most misunderstood practice in all of philosophy. If you're ready to discover why deliberately imagining your worst fears can set you free from them forever, leave your like, share this video with someone who needs to break free from fear's grip, comment below which fear has been controlling your life, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that will transform how you face life's challenges. James lived his entire life in the shadow of one fear: losing his job. Every morning he woke up anxious, checking his phone for any signs of company trouble. Every meeting felt like a potential trap. Every interaction with his boss carried the weight of possible disaster. He worked overtime constantly, not because he loved his job, but because he was terrified of what would happen if he lost it. His relationships suffered because he was always stressed. His health deteriorated from chronic anxiety. His dreams remained dreams because he couldn't risk any change that might threaten his employment. James was a prisoner of his own mind, and fear was the warden. He spent 30 years of his life trying to prevent something that might never happen, and in doing so, he prevented himself from truly living. The irony was crushing. In trying so hard to avoid losing his job, he lost his life. Then there was Sarah, who discovered something that changed everything. Instead of running from her fear of financial ruin, she decided to face it directly using an ancient Stoic practice. Every morning for 10 minutes, she would sit quietly and vividly imagine losing everything: her job, her savings, her house, her lifestyle. She pictured herself starting over with nothing but her skills and determination. At first, this exercise was terrifying. Her heart would race, her palms would sweat, her mind would spiral. But something remarkable began to happen after weeks of this practice. The fear started losing its power. By repeatedly facing her worst-case scenario in her imagination, Sarah discovered she could handle it. More importantly, she realized that even if everything went wrong, she would survive and rebuild. This realization transformed her entire relationship with risk and opportunity. She started her own business, left a toxic relationship, and began living with a courage she never knew she possessed. This is the power of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and it represents everything modern culture teaches you not to do. You're told to think positive, visualize success, focus on good outcomes. The Stoics knew better. They understood that trying to avoid thinking about bad things doesn't prevent them from happening. It just ensures you'll be devastated when they do. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, regularly imagined losing his throne, his family, even his life. Seneca, one of Rome's wealthiest citizens, constantly contemplated poverty and exile. Epictetus, who had experienced slavery firsthand, taught his students to meditate on loss and hardship. These weren't morbid men obsessed with disaster. They were strategists who refused to be controlled by the unknown. Here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to face. Most of your fears are based on illusions, and the few that aren't are far less devastating than you imagine. You fear losing your job, but you've never actually experienced unemployment and discovered what you're truly capable of when challenged. You fear rejection, but you've never faced it head-on and realized that your worth isn't determined by others' opinions. You fear failure, but you've never failed spectacularly and learned that failure is often the doorway to success. Your mind has created elaborate horror stories about potential futures, and these stories have more power over you than reality itself. David learned this lesson when his greatest fear became his greatest teacher. He was terrified of public speaking, avoiding every opportunity that might require presenting to groups. This fear shaped his entire career, keeping him in roles that were safe but unfulfilling. When he finally decided to use Stoic negative visualization, he began spending 5 minutes each day vividly imagining giving a presentation and having everything go wrong. forgetting his words, being laughed at, humiliating himself completely. Initially, this exercise increased his anxiety, but as he continued, something shifted. He began to see that even if the worst happened, it wouldn't destroy him. He started asking himself practical questions. What exactly would happen if I forgot my words? I'd pause, collect my thoughts, and continue. What if people laughed? I'd acknowledge the mistake and move on. What if I humiliated myself? I'd learn from it and do better next time. By facing his fear in imagination, David robbed it of its power in reality. When he finally gave his first presentation, he was nervous but not paralyzed. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. The genius of negative visualization lies in its psychological precision. Fear thrives in the unknown, feeds on imagination, and grows stronger in darkness. When you deliberately drag your fears into the light of consciousness and examine them methodically, you discover that most of them are paper tigers, frightening in shadow but powerless in daylight. The few fears that represent real challenges become manageable problems to solve, rather than overwhelming disasters to avoid. This practice doesn't eliminate fear. It transforms your relationship with it from slavery to mastery. Modern psychology has validated what the Stoics knew intuitively. Exposure therapy, one of the most effective treatments for anxiety disorders, works by gradually exposing people to their fears in controlled settings until the fear response diminishes. Negative visualization is exposure therapy for the mind. You expose yourself to feared scenarios in imagination until they lose their emotional charge. The difference is that instead of waiting until fear becomes debilitating and seeking professional help, you can use this ancient technique to prevent fear from ever gaining control of your life. Rachel discovered this when her fear of aging began consuming her thoughts. She was 35 and terrified of growing old, losing her beauty, becoming irrelevant. This fear drove her to expensive treatments, obsessive exercise, and constant anxiety about the passage of time. When she learned about Stoic practices, she began deliberately visualizing herself as an old woman, wrinkled, gray-haired, physically diminished. At first, this was horrifying, but as she continued the practice, she began to see aging differently. She imagined herself as a wise elder, sharing knowledge with younger generations, finding joy in simple pleasures, appreciating each day as a gift rather than a loss. By facing her fear of aging directly, Rachel transformed it from a source of anxiety into a source of perspective. She stopped trying to prevent the inevitable and started focusing on making each stage of life meaningful. Here's what separates those who live freely from those who live in fear's prison. Free people have faced their worst-case scenarios and discovered they can handle them, while imprisoned people avoid thinking about potential disasters and remain vulnerable to them. When you practice negative visualization regularly, you build what psychologists call emotional resilience and what the Stoics called inner strength. You develop the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you because you've already handled it in your imagination. The first step in mastering this practice is choosing the right fears to face. Start with the anxieties that currently limit your actions. The job loss that prevents you from taking risks, the rejection that stops you from pursuing relationships, the failure that keeps you from trying new things. Don't begin with existential terrors like death or cosmic meaninglessness. Start with practical fears that have specific, manageable components. The goal is to build your capacity gradually, not to overwhelm yourself with scenarios too large to process effectively. Second, make your visualization specific and realistic, not vague or catastrophic. Instead of imagining something terrible happening, picture exact scenarios with concrete details. What would you do on day one of unemployment? Where would you live if you lost your house? How would you rebuild if your business failed? The more specific your visualization, the more your mind can work on practical solutions rather than remaining stuck in abstract dread. Marcus Aurelius didn't just contemplate bad things happening. He imagined specific challenges to his rule and planned how he would respond with dignity and effectiveness. Third, always include your response to the imagined scenario, not just the scenario itself. The point isn't to torture yourself with terrible possibilities, but to rehearse handling them with strength and wisdom. See yourself responding to job loss by immediately networking and skill building. Picture yourself handling rejection by maintaining dignity and seeking new opportunities. Imagine yourself facing failure by learning from mistakes and trying different approaches. This mental rehearsal builds real confidence because you're not just facing fears, you're practicing overcoming them. Jake was paralyzed by fear of financial ruin until he decided to map out exactly what that would look like and how he would handle it. He spent weeks visualizing losing his savings, his home, his comfortable lifestyle. But instead of stopping there, he imagined his response, moving to a smaller place, finding ways to reduce expenses, developing new income streams, asking for help when needed. He visualized himself not just surviving financial disaster, but rebuilding stronger and wiser. This exercise was initially terrifying, but it gave Jake something precious, a plan. He realized that even his worst-case scenario was survivable and that surviving it would teach him things he needed to know. This knowledge freed him to take calculated risks that eventually led to far greater financial security than his fear-based approach ever could. The most powerful aspect of negative visualization is how it reveals the difference between what you fear losing and what you actually need to be happy. Most fears are based on attachment to things that, while pleasant, aren't necessary for your well-being. When you imagine losing your possessions, status, or circumstances, you often discover that your core happiness doesn't depend on these external things as much as you believed. This realization is liberating. It frees you from the exhausting work of protecting things that can't actually harm you if lost. Olivia learned this when she faced her deepest fear, being alone. She was terrified of ending up single, unloved, and isolated. This fear kept her in an unhappy relationship and prevented her from developing her own interests and identity. When she began practicing negative visualization, she imagined herself single, living alone, spending evenings and weekends by herself. Initially, this visualization was painful, but as she continued, she began to see possibilities she had never considered. She imagined herself reading books she loved, pursuing hobbies she enjoyed, traveling places her partner had never wanted to visit. She pictured herself developing deeper friendships, becoming more self-reliant, discovering who she was when not defined by a relationship. By the end of 6 months of this practice, Olivia had transformed her relationship with solitude from terror to curiosity. She ended her unhappy relationship and spent a year single, discovering that being alone was not the catastrophe she had imagined. It was an opportunity for growth. Here's the forbidden truth about fear that society doesn't want you to know. Most of your fears are designed to keep you small, compliant, and dependent. Fear of job loss keeps you accepting poor treatment from employers. Fear of rejection keeps you from forming authentic relationships. Fear of failure keeps you from pursuing meaningful goals. Fear of judgment keeps you conforming to expectations that don't serve you. When you master your relationship with fear through practices like negative visualization, you become dangerous to systems that profit from your compliance and dependence. The ancient Stoics understood that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to act wisely despite fear's presence. When you regularly practice confronting your fears in imagination, you develop this crucial capacity. Fear becomes information rather than instruction. You can feel afraid and still make rational decisions. You can acknowledge risk while still taking worthwhile chances. You can face uncertainty while still moving toward your goals. Adam discovered this when his fear of career change kept him trapped in a job he hated for 10 years. He was terrified of starting over, learning new skills, potentially earning less money, or discovering he wasn't capable of success in a different field. These fears were so strong that he stayed in a position that was literally making him sick with stress and depression. When he finally began visualizing career change scenarios, including the worst possible outcomes, he made a shocking discovery. Even the bad outcomes were better than his current situation. He imagined struggling in a new career and realized that struggling toward something meaningful was preferable to succeeding at something soul-crushing. He pictured earning less money and discovered he could reduce his expenses and still be happier. He visualized failing completely and saw that he could always find another job, having gained valuable experience and self-knowledge. This practice gave Adam the courage to leave his toxic job and pursue work that aligned with his values and interests. The deepest power of negative visualization is that it builds acceptance alongside courage. When you've imagined losing something repeatedly, you develop a healthy detachment from it. You can enjoy possessions, relationships, and circumstances without being enslaved by the fear of losing them. This doesn't make you cold or uncaring. It makes you free to love and enjoy without the anxiety that comes from attachment. You appreciate what you have more deeply because you're not constantly worried about protecting it. Seneca wrote, "What is grief but an opinion?" He meant that our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our thoughts about events. When you practice negative visualization, you're training your mind to think about potential losses differently. Instead of seeing loss as catastrophe, you begin to see it as challenge. Instead of viewing change as threat, you start to see it as opportunity. Instead of experiencing uncertainty as terror, you learn to experience it as adventure. The final truth about this forbidden Stoic weapon is that it works by reversing the relationship between you and your fears. Instead of your fears controlling your choices, you learn to use fear as a tool for better decision-making. Fear becomes a signal to pay attention, to prepare carefully, to act thoughtfully, but not a reason to avoid action altogether. When you know you can handle the worst-case scenario, you're free to pursue the best-case scenario with confidence and wisdom. Every great achievement requires facing the fear of failure. Every meaningful relationship requires risking rejection. Every authentic life requires disappointing some people's expectations. The choice is not whether to face these fears. The choice is whether to face them on your terms through practices like negative visualization, or to have them imposed on you by circumstances beyond your control. The Stoics chose deliberate preparation over reactive panic, mental training over wishful thinking, and the courage to face reality over the comfort of living in illusion. This ancient weapon against fear is available to anyone willing to use it, but few have the courage to pick it up. Those who do discover what the Stoics knew, that the thing you fear most is rarely as powerful as the fear itself, and the person who has faced their fears in imagination becomes nearly impossible to control through threats of what might happen. The ultimate freedom is knowing you can handle whatever comes, and negative visualization is the practice that builds this unshakable foundation of inner strength.